What if I told you a simple little bug that occurred in one of the most popular video games of all time's source code led to a full-on online pandemic, infecting and killing thousands of players with an in-game disease that spread like wildfire throughout the game world, with the resulting fallout leading to a complete change in the players' behaviors as they tried their best to navigate this, at the time, unknown plague, by doing things such as migrating out of populated city centers, setting up healing clinics, warning each other of dangerous quarantine zones, widespread unregulated PvP, and even players purposefully trying to spread the disease as far and wide as they could, essentially causing a virtual pseudo-pandemic in the game world. The result of this mayhem went on to lead real-life doctors and researchers at different universities to use this very in-game event as study material to better understand how viruses spread in a high-volume population. Well, I'm excited to tell you that this actually happened, and yes, it is as good as it sounds. I'm Jimbleton James, and let's talk about the 2005 Corrupted Blood incident in World of Warcraft. The Corrupted Blood incident, also known as the World of Warcraft pandemic, took place between September 13th and October 8th, way back in 2005. If you for some reason are unfamiliar with this behemoth of a game, World of Warcraft is a massively multiplayer online role-playing game developed by Blizzard Entertainment that was initially released in 2004, which at its height averaged around 8.5 million monthly players, with the estimated average daily player count sitting at approximately 700,000 to 1,650,000 players. Needless to say, it is one of the most successful and well-known MMORPGs to date, which makes this Corrupted Blood incident all the more interesting. This Corrupted Blood incident all began when players began participating in a World of Warcraft raid set in the jungles of Zul'Gurub, also known as the Zul'Gurub Raid, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which was released in World of Warcraft's patch 1.7. In this raid, players would reach the final boss, where they went up against a character by the name of Hakar, the Soul Flayer, otherwise known as the Blood God, who would cast a specific spell on players, infecting them with a debuff known as Corrupted Blood. This Corrupted Blood debuff would cause direct damage to any players hit by it, and even after taking the initial damage, would suffer some hefty damage over time effects, which would tick down the player's health, with the damage per second taking off around 263 to 337 HP every 2 seconds. As of patch 1.7, this debuff was later nerfed to do less damage in patch 1.9. As a result of this ensuing pandemic, this isn't as bad as it sounds for the players who were high enough level for this raid, as the average player level at the time for those in this raid would have been around level 60, which means most players averaged a max health pool of around 3,000 to 4,500, meaning they could withstand the effects of the Corrupted Blood debuff for some time, as their HP wore down, meaning they would be able to survive for extended periods of time even with the debuff active. Still, it sounds like a pretty bad spell to be hit by, right? Well, this is the kicker. In addition to the damage over time effects, the debuff while present on players could then be transmitted to other players in close proximity, causing the damage over time effects to spread to any allies in the vicinity of the afflicted player. So if one of your party was afflicted with this Corrupted Blood debuff, odds are you were too. This debuff was originally intended by the Blizzard developers to be restricted only to the Zul'Gurub raid, with the effects of it dissipating when the players leave the raid area, which is all fine and good. However, due to a programming oversight in the game's code, this Corrupted Blood affliction could persist on players' animal companions, such as hunter pets or their warlock minions, outside of the raid boundaries. Once players became aware of the process of getting the Corrupted Blood debuff to persist in the outside world through their pets, Some of the more chaotic evil players out there figured out ways to deliberately infect their pets, then leave the raid, and by dismissing their pets before the debuff expired, they could preserve the effects of the debuff until resummoned. Talk about some pure evil scientist energy there. What this meant was that players could essentially unleash this corrupted blood effect on anyone, anywhere within the world of Warcraft, at their will by simply resummoning their infected pet companion. This served as the primary disease vector and the precursor for the Ground Zero event. This was it. Once the method of transmission was made known, doom was unleashed upon the unsuspecting WoW population. These players, with their freshly infected pet companions, would begin to spread the corrupted blood debuff far and wide, infecting unsuspecting players roaming the lands of Azeroth, the name of the land you play in World of Warcraft. This led to it spreading uncontrollably in massive numbers to hundreds of thousands of different players. Within mere hours, the corrupted blood debuff had infected entire cities, most notably Ironforge and Orgrimmar, which at the time were central hubs in the game, containing massive player concentrations. These cities before the corrupted blood plague hit were large and prosperous areas for communication, chatting, questing, grouping up, trade, and more. But that quickly changed when panic and confusion spread through the population as the corrupted blood virus began to ravage its way through all these players. Nobody knew what was happening, as most of the players were unfamiliar with Hakar the Soulflare and his corrupted blood debuff at the time, as dozens of players began falling over dead in the streets, while hundreds more began taking chip damage from this debuff and running around and trying to get away from it, and subsequently infecting other players. This debuff made short work of lower level players, who were being killed in mere seconds from its damage over time effects as soon as they were afflicted, whereas higher level players could survive long enough to unwillingly become transmission carriers themselves, which resulted in the cycle of reinfection of players previously killed or afflicted by it. Even worse, the corrupted blood debuff was one of the only effects within the game that could be contracted and spread by NPCs, causing them to unintentionally become unwilling subjects of the all-encompassing sickness that was the corrupted blood debuff, and further amplifying the infection rate. This was the perfect storm that caused hundreds and hundreds of player deaths all over the game world for almost 26 days. Skeletons of dead players literally littered the streets as players tried their best to survive the onslaught of this disease as it tore through the now fragmented population in a vicious cycle of reinfection, death, respawning, reinfection, death, respawning. The player reaction to this in-game pandemic varied, with some players becoming traveling healers, casting healing and protection spells on the afflicted, in an effort to stop or halt the spread, while others warned unsuspecting players to steer clear of outbreak zones and city centers, while passing each other on the traveling paths throughout the world, with lots choosing to reside in the wilderness until all of this blew over. Some would even flag for PvP, allowing them to be unaffected by non-PvP players and their effects. This included the corrupted blood effect. However, this inevitably caused player-on-player violence amid the surging infection, which led to even further anarchy. Some players, on top of the already existing chaos, would further add fuel to the fire by intentionally contracting the debuff with the goal of spreading it across the game world, deliberately trying to infect as many people as possible. These players were known as griefers, but I much prefer to see them as some sort of mad, corrupted blood followers of Hakar the Soulflare, enacting its will or something like some crazed blood minions. Either way, these players just wanted to see the world burn. During the time the corrupted blood plague was destroying the panicked and confused population, the internet was in an uproar over the virus taking over the game, with sites like the Blizzard forums being jam-packed with confusion and questions as players looked for answers to this rampant online pandemic. Blizzard scrambled to release several hotfixes that would halt the unintended spread of the corrupted blood debuff from leaving the initial raid boundaries. But even after several hastily implemented hotfixes, there was no solution to the rampaging disease. Due to the apparent, and I quote, really hacky code, the Blizzard team couldn't properly remove the disease from players' companions, and instead decided to roll out a few hotfixes to try to dampen the spread by adding prevention measures into the game, like massive barriers around specific quarantine zones to try to limit the spread. However, players would naturally find their ways to bypass these barriers, and as a result, areas previously recovering from the infection would begin yet another new wave of the disease. Blizzard finally put a stop to the pandemic by performing a hard reset of all of their servers, and later releasing a patch stopping all companions from contracting the Corrupted Blood debuff entirely, thus ending the infamous Corrupted Blood virtual pandemic of 2005, cementing its history as the very first true virtual pandemic. Despite the crippling impact of this Corrupted Blood debuff plague on World of Warcraft and its players, the fan reaction to the pandemic was strangely positive, with lots of players enjoying having to try to survive this plague, almost treating it as an in-game event. The fan reaction was so positive that this infamous incident's popularity directly influenced Blizzard when designing their Zombie Infestation pre-release plague event in anticipation for the game's second expansion, The Wrath of the Lich King. And believe it or not, this Corrupted Blood craziness actually helped several researchers understand and predict the spread of real diseases, using the spread of the virus and the population patterns players underwent as a roadmap for several real-life pandemics, and using this to predict how people would react to real pandemics. Namely, Reuters, a popular news company, published an article discussing the causes and effects of the Corrupted Blood's outbreak and its relation to the swine flu pandemic of 2009 and 2010, with university researchers studying the Corrupted Blood's progression through the World of Warcraft's population to better understand real-life spreading patterns of the swine flu at this time. In addition to this, in March 2020, PC Gamer published an interview in which the authors of a 2007 research paper on the Corrupted Blood incident, Dr. Eric Lofgren and Dr. Nina Fennerman, discussed how the research from the game's outbreak was actively helping them understand the spread of COVID-19, specifically in terms of social behavior, with even Dr. Lofgren stating that one of the critiques on his paper at the time was that griefers didn't really exist in real life like they did in WoW. However, understanding that pandemics are a social problem, some people may be, and I quote, willfully ignoring the potential for them to get others sick, and that minimizing the seriousness of getting others sick is a sort of real-world griefing, which can be tied back to those absolutely crazed World of Warcraft players who wanted to infect everyone and kind of just wanted to see the world fall into chaos. So what can we learn from Dr. Eric Lofgren's statements? Well, we can see that during a pandemic, taking no precautions at all doesn't just affect you, but others you come into contact with, whether you realize it or not. And with that, this spells the end of this extremely cool and wacky internet phenomena. What do you guys think of this? I personally find it super interesting and almost kind of cool that this event even happened at all. A small oversight in the code caused a literal e-pandemic inside a video game, leading to hundreds of thousands of players enacting actual pandemic avoidance behaviors and revealing the best and worst sides of people in a time of a crisis. This might be the most damage any raid boss in any game ever has done to the players, and I also find that absolutely insanely cool. Hakar the Soul Flayer really be out here flaying souls. Let me know in the comments if you were playing World of Warcraft during this and you experienced these crazy events, or if you've even played World of Warcraft at all. Would you have liked to experience this pandemic firsthand? I know I would have. How do you think people would react nowadays if something like this happened in other MMOs, like Elder Scrolls Online, Runescape, or Final Fantasy? Anyways, thanks for listening, and if you want, feel free to leave a like or subscribe. as I plan to make more videos on weird and wacky internet stories in the future if you're interested. And with that, we put a close on the Corrupted Blood incident of 2005 in gaming history forever. Have a good one. See you guys later.